A black doctor had just finished a grueling 36-hour shift at the hospital. Saving lives, making impossible decisions, and holding the hands of patients who had no one else. He was exhausted but relieved. He was finally heading home. But the moment he stepped into the airport, everything changed. A security officer locked eyes on him, scrutinizing him in a way that none of the other travelers received. Without cause, without explanation, he was pulled aside. The questions started. Aggressive, condescending, humiliating. Passengers stopped and stared. The officer didn't care that he was a doctor. Didn't care that his ID was valid. That his credentials were impeccable. To him, he was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. But 7 minutes later, something happened that no one saw coming. The situation took a turn so shocking. It sent ripples far beyond that airport terminal. What happened next? It's a story you need to hear. Stay with me. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in standing against injustice, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this deserve to be heard. Now, let's begin. The bus station smelled of damp pavement and cold metal. The kind of smell that clung to you long after you had left it behind. Nathaniel Lewis stepped off the bus with the slow deliberation of a man who knew he was being watched. Not by anyone in particular. Not yet, anyway, but by the world itself. A world that had spent decades telling him that it did not belong to him. His coat was buttoned to the top. His hands deep in his pockets. His breath curling in the winter air. He had returned to Birmingham after 25 years in Chicago, and though the streets had changed, the air had not. It still carried the weight of history, of whispers exchanged in back rooms, of rules never spoken but always followed. The bus driver, a young white man who had barely glanced at Nathaniel when he boarded, watched him now as he stepped down onto the curb, not with curiosity, but with something colder, something older. Nathaniel had seen it before. "You forget something, sir?" the driver asked. His voice flat. Nathaniel turned, shook his head. "No, just getting my bearings." The driver nodded, but did not look convinced. He tapped the side of the bus with his palm, signaling to the passengers still inside that they would be leaving soon. As Nathaniel walked toward the station doors, he could feel the weight of the man's gaze on his back. Inside, the station was neither full nor empty. A transient place caught between moments. A young mother rocked a restless baby near the vending machines. A businessman in a stiff gray suit tapped impatiently on his phone. And a group of teenagers whispered to one another, their laughter bouncing off the tiled floors. Nathaniel made his way to the ticket counter. The clerk, a white woman in her 50s with tight blonde curls and a name tag that read Judith, barely glanced up as he approached. "Next," she said. "One ticket to Montgomery," Nathaniel said. She exhaled through her nose. Not quite a sigh but something close to it, and tapped at the keys in front of her. She did not meet his eyes. "That'll be $4. Nathaniel slid a crisp $5 bill across the counter. She took it without a word, punched a button on the register, and then hesitated. Her eyes flickered up to him, her fingers curling slightly around the change she was about to hand back. There was something else in her look now. Something less distant, something almost familiar. "You from around here?" she asked. Nathaniel paused. He could have said no. It would have been easier that way. But he had learned, long ago, that there was no use in running from history. "I was," he said, "a long time ago." Judith nodded slowly, as if she had been expecting that answer. She set the change down on the counter rather than handing it to him directly. "Things have changed," she said. Nathaniel picked up his ticket, his fingers brushing against the worn paper. "Have they?" She didn't answer. The moment stretched between them, silent and heavy, and then, just as quickly, it was over. She turned to the next customer, her voice sharp and impersonal once more. "Next." Nathaniel stepped away from the counter, his grip tightening around the ticket. He had only been back in town for 15 minutes, and already, he could feel the old ghosts stirring. Yes, things had changed, but not nearly enough. Nathaniel Lewis found a seat near the back of the waiting area, setting his bag beside him. The bus to Montgomery wouldn't leave for another hour, and he had nowhere else to be. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. Though the cold had nothing to do with the air temperature. The station had a rhythm to it. One he had known all his life. The low murmur of voices. The scuff of shoes against tile. The hollow announcement of arriving and departing buses. It was the kind of place where time felt slow and stretched thin. A place where everyone waited for something. Whether they knew it or not. Across the aisle, an elderly white man sat with a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. He was dressed in a tweed jacket that smelled of pipe smoke. His reading glasses balanced at the end of his nose. Nathaniel caught the briefest flicker of his eyes before they dropped back to the newsprint. It was a look he recognized. Not outright hostility. No, nothing as simple as that. Just a quiet assertion of place. A reminder that there were rules. Even in silence. Nathaniel held the man's gaze a second longer than was polite. Long enough to make the man shift uncomfortably in his seat. Then, just as deliberately, he turned away. He had no interest in a battle of stares. But the thing about this kind of quiet violence, the kind that did not come with raised fists or shouted slurs, was that it never truly left you. It settled into your skin. Into your bones. It made the air feel heavier. Made your body feel like something that had to be accounted for. Like something that had to ask permission to exist. A few seats down, a young black woman was feeding her son bits of crackers from a plastic bag. The child, no more than 4, kicked his legs excitedly against the metal bench. "Stop that, baby," the woman said, her voice tired but patient. The boy grinned up at her. "Why?" "Because I said so." The boy pouted but obeyed. His little feet going still. Nathaniel watched them quietly, remembering his own mother. How her voice had carried that same mixture of exhaustion and love. It was then that the station manager appeared. A thick-set man in a tan uniform. A walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He surveyed the waiting area as if it belonged to him. His gaze skipping over the white passengers and landing, predictably, on the woman and her child. Nathaniel saw it happen in real time. The way the man's mouth tightened. The way his posture stiffened. He walked over. Slow but purposeful. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a little too loud. "I'm gonna have to ask you to keep your boy still. Other passengers are trying to rest." The woman looked up, confused. "He's not bothering anyone." The station manager exhaled a deep, exaggerated breath. "I understand, but rules are rules. We want to keep things orderly. Don't we?" Nathaniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. Because he had seen this before. 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. A child's laughter too loud. A conversation in the wrong tone. A body occupying too much space in a world that was not designed for it. The woman hesitated, her eyes scanning the room. Searching for support she would not find. "I'll keep him still," she said, her voice quiet now. "Good," the station manager said, satisfied. He nodded, adjusted his belt, and walked away. Nathaniel could feel the tension lingering in the air long after he had gone. The mother picked up her son, settling him on her lap. Her arms wrapped protectively around him. The boy, too young to understand what had just happened, nuzzled into her neck, still smiling. Nathaniel wanted to say something. To her, to the boy, to the room itself, but he knew that words would not change what had just taken place. Not here, not now. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He waited. And the world kept turning. Just as it always had. Nathaniel Lewis was used to waiting. The bus finally arrived, hissing and groaning like an old man stretching his limbs. He stood, adjusting the strap of his bag over his shoulder, and let the others move first. An elderly white couple, a traveling salesman with a scuffed leather briefcase, 2 young soldiers still wearing their fatigues. Then, the mother and her child. She carried the boy now. His small arms wrapped around her neck. His head tucked into the curve of her shoulder. A quiet child. He understood, in the way that all black children did, that the world required his silence. Nathaniel followed them onto the bus, taking in the familiar geography, the first rows, where white passengers settled in without thought, and the back, where folks who looked like him moved automatically, without needing to be told. He stepped into the aisle, counted the rows, There was no sign separating one part of the bus from the other anymore. No official rule, but the lines had been drawn long before paint and metal had been involved. The mother slid into a seat near the rear, adjusting her child in her lap. Nathaniel took the seat across from her, resting his bag beside him. The bus driver, a thick-set man with a cigarette balanced behind his ear, pulled the doors shut and leaned into the microphone. "All right, folks. Next stop, Selma." The bus lurched forward, and the road stretched out before them, long and unbroken. It didn't take long for the trouble to start. Nathaniel had seen the man before he even stepped onto the bus. One of those types, middle-aged, sunburned, with a paunch pressing against the buttons of his shirt. The kind of man who believed the world had given too much to people like Nathaniel and not enough to people like him. He entered the bus with a slow, heavy swagger, chewing something in the side of his mouth. His eyes swept over the rows, pausing when he reached the middle. He frowned. Nathaniel knew why. A white woman sat alone in a seat across the aisle, the only open spot beside her. The man stood in the aisle for a long moment, as if weighing something unspoken. Then, his gaze drifted back to where Nathaniel sat, back to the mother and child. He made his decision. Turning on his heel, he moved toward the rear of the bus, toward the seats where black passengers sat. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. He had seen this, too. Some people would rather endure discomfort than sit beside someone they considered beneath them. The man stopped beside Nathaniel's row, his weight shifting between his feet. "I need this seat," he said. It wasn't a question. Nathaniel looked up at him, his expression unreadable. There was space beside Nathaniel, but it was tight, and there were other seats further back. But that wasn't the point. Was it? Nathaniel studied him, noting the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his jaw tightened just slightly. "He doesn't want to sit here," Nathaniel realized. "He just wants me to move." The mother across the aisle shifted, pressing her son closer. Nathaniel glanced at her, and saw the flicker of warning in her eyes. "Let it go." A younger man might have argued, might have made a scene. But Nathaniel had learned long ago that there were battles you could win and battles that were already lost before they began. He moved his bag, pressing himself against the window, making just enough room for the man to sit. The man hesitated, maybe expecting more resistance, maybe disappointed that he wouldn't get a fight. Then, he sat. Nathaniel turned toward the window, watching the world blur past. The man beside him exhaled through his nose, muttering something under his breath. A word that had been spat at Nathaniel before. A word that had settled in his bones long ago. Nathaniel didn't react. He just kept looking out at the road, at the miles still left ahead of them. Because that, too, was something he had learned. Sometimes, the only way to keep moving forward was to pretend you didn't hear a damn thing. Nathaniel Lewis had been in enough rooms to know the rules. They weren't written down, not in any way that mattered. They weren't posted on the walls like a child's school schedule. But the rules existed all the same, stitched into the fabric of every meeting, every transaction, every conversation. Rule 1. Know your place. Rule 2. Speak only when spoken to. Rule 3. No matter what happens, don't make them uncomfortable. The office was colder than it needed to be, the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. Nathaniel sat in the chair opposite the desk, his hands resting lightly in his lap, his back straight, the same posture he had learned as a boy in church, the same way his mother told him to sit when they visited the bank. The man across from him barely looked up, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose as he flipped through a stack of papers. His name, Mr. Jennings, was written on a brass plate sitting on the edge of the desk. Nathaniel waited. Jennings sighed, finally lifting his eyes. "Mr. Lewis," he said, adjusting his glasses. "You understand why you're here." Nathaniel nodded. "Your work has been adequate." A pause. "But I've had some concerns." Another pause. This one longer. Jennings didn't say what the concerns were. Nathaniel had heard enough of these conversations to know how they worked. The words weren't about what had already happened. They were about what could happen. About what might be a problem. If he wasn't careful. Jennings folded his hands on the desk. "Some of your coworkers have said you don't always. What's the word I'm looking for? Integrate." Nathaniel held back a sigh. The word was different, but the meaning was the same. You keep to yourself. You don't play the game. You don't make us comfortable. Nathaniel had spent years learning how to be as unthreatening as possible. A firm handshake, but not too firm. Good posture, but not too rigid. Eye contact, but not too much. But none of it ever seemed to be enough. Jennings cleared his throat. There was also an incident last week. Nathaniel didn't move a beat. Then, Jennings pulled a file from the stack and flipped it open. A client said you were dismissive. Nathaniel knew what this was about before Jennings even finished the sentence. The man had walked into the bank, barely looking at Nathaniel as he approached the counter. You people always take too long with these transactions, he had muttered. Nathaniel had tightened his jaw, kept his face unreadable, and continued counting the bills. His hands steady. When he handed the receipt over, the man snatched it from his fingers without a word. Nathaniel hadn't said anything, not a single thing. But silence, too, could be a crime. Jennings sighed. Look, Nathaniel, quote, Mr. Lewis, Nathaniel corrected, his voice even. Jennings' brow furrowed, as if he were surprised. Nathaniel knew that surprise well. The surprise of a man who thought respect was something given, rather than something earned. Jennings exhaled. Mr. Lewis, he said, with just enough hesitation to make the words feel sour in his mouth. I need you to understand something. It's not just about doing the job. It's about fitting in. There it was, the part of the conversation that actually mattered. The words were dressed up, polished enough to sound professional. But the meaning beneath them was simple. Know your place. Nathaniel thought of his father, of the way he had carried himself when he walked into a room full of white men. He thought of his uncle, who had worked 30 years at a factory, only to be passed over for every promotion. He thought of his mother, who had told him, you have to work twice as hard for half as much. He had learned the rules of the room a long time ago. But that didn't mean he had to like them. Nathaniel inhaled slowly, then exhaled, keeping his voice level. I appreciate the feedback, Mr. Jennings. I'll keep it in mind. Jennings studied him, searching for something. Maybe submission, maybe fear. He wouldn't find either. After a moment, Jennings nodded. Good. That's all. Nathaniel rose to his feet, adjusting his tie, and walked toward the door. Rule 4. They don't have to like you. But you still have to survive. Nathaniel Lewis knew that silence could be both a weapon and a shield. It could protect, conceal, and, when necessary, punish. He had learned this lesson early. In classrooms where his intelligence was ignored. In stores where the clerks watched him too closely. In streets where police officers looked at him a second too long. Silence was survival. But on this particular morning, silence felt heavy. He stood at the bank counter, straight-backed, his crisp white shirt neatly tucked into his slacks. The morning light streamed through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Customers filtered in and out. The rhythm of the day predictable. Until it wasn't. Excuse me. A sharp voice cut through the air. Nathaniel looked up to see a woman standing in front of him. Her expression set with impatience. She was white, well-dressed. The kind of customer who expected service before she even had to ask. Her hands, adorned with gold rings, tapped against the counter. I've been waiting, she said, her voice carrying the slight tremor of someone unused to being made to wait. Nathaniel nodded, his face unreadable. How can I assist you today, ma'am? Her eyes flicked over him. You can assist me by explaining why it took so long for someone to acknowledge me. Nathaniel glanced at the line behind her. He had moved as quickly as possible. No one else seemed upset. Still, he chose his words carefully. I apologize if you feel you weren't served in a timely manner. How can I help? She exhaled sharply, as if his calmness only irritated her more. I need to make a withdrawal. And I expect it to be handled quickly this time. Nathaniel took her ID and account information, moving through the steps as efficiently as possible. He could feel her gaze pressing into him, waiting for something, for a mistake, for a sign that he didn't belong here. The weight of her scrutiny was nothing new. When he slid the cash across the counter, she snatched it up, her fingers grazing his for the briefest second before she recoiled. as though the contact itself had offended her. Her lips parted, hesitation flickering across her face. She wanted to say something else, wanted to press the moment further. But instead, she huffed, turned sharply on her heel, and walked away. Nathaniel exhaled. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. An hour later, Jennings called him into his office. Nathaniel sat in the same chair as last time, hands folded in his lap, waiting. Jennings sighed and leaned forward, rubbing his temples. Mr. Lewis, we have a problem. Nathaniel didn't react. That customer from earlier, Jennings continued, his fingers drumming against the desk. She said you were hostile toward her. Nathaniel blinked. Hostile? Jennings nodded. She said you were dismissive. That you made her feel uncomfortable. There it was. That word again. Uncomfortable. It was never about what was said. It was about how they felt. It was about the invisible rules that men like Nathaniel were expected to follow. The ones that demanded he smile, nod, and reassure people that his presence in the room was not a threat. Nathaniel could have told Jennings the truth. He could have pointed out that he had done nothing wrong, that the woman had come in already looking for a problem. But the truth didn't matter in these situations. It never had. Jennings sighed. Look, I know you're a hard worker. I know you're good at what you do. Nathaniel waited. He knew there was a bit coming. But you have to be more aware of how you come across. There it was. Nathaniel held his silence, his expression neutral. Jennings leaned back in his chair. You understand, don't you? Nathaniel understood. He understood that he was being given a warning. That it didn't matter if the complaint had no merit. That it didn't matter if he had done everything right. He understood that a white woman's discomfort weighed more than his dignity. Nathaniel nodded once. Yes, sir. I understand. Jennings looked relieved. Good. Just be mindful. Nathaniel rose, adjusted his tie, and left the office. In the hallway, he paused. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Silence had protected him, but it had also betrayed him. And for the first time in a long time, Nathaniel wondered how much longer he was willing to carry its weight. Nathaniel Lewis had learned long ago that the rules of the game were never written down. They were implied, understood, passed down in glances, in warnings, in the silence that filled a room after a moment too heavy to ignore. And today, he was being reminded, once again, that the game was rigged. It began with a meeting. Nathaniel had been called into Jennings' office again. But this time, the air felt different. The blinds were drawn, the desk was cluttered, and the expression on Jennings' face was one of careful calculation. Across from him sat Richard Calloway, the district manager, a man whose handshake was always too firm, whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Nathaniel took his seat. Mr. Lewis, Calloway said, folding his hands together as if he were preparing to deliver a sermon. We've been reviewing some concerns about your customer interactions. Nathaniel's fingers twitched, but he forced himself to stay still. Concerns, he repeated, his voice even. Calloway nodded. Yes. Now, let me be clear. We value your work here. We know you're dedicated, professional, but we have to take customer feedback seriously. Jennings shifted in his seat but said nothing. Nathaniel kept his face unreadable. He already knew where this was going. I understand, he said, because that was what he was supposed to say. Calloway exhaled, relieved. Good. That's good. We just want to ensure that every customer feels comfortable when they step into this bank. Comfortable. There it was again. Nathaniel nodded once. Of course. Calloway smiled. But it wasn't real. We're considering rotating some responsibilities. Spreading things out a bit more. Giving you less direct customer interaction. Just for the time being. Nathaniel felt the weight of those words settle over him. Less direct customer interaction. A demotion without calling it one. A slow step toward the exit. His mind moved quickly, calculating. He could protest, ask for specifics, and demand proof of these so-called concerns. But it wouldn't matter. The moment he did, he would become the problem. So he nodded. If that's what's best for the bank. Calloway beamed, pleased with how easily the matter had been settled. We knew you'd be reasonable. Jennings still hadn't spoken. Nathaniel stood, shook both their hands, and left the office. He walked back to his desk. Past the rows of tellers who hadn't been pulled into quiet meetings about concerns. Past coworkers who would never have to question whether they were being slowly erased from their jobs. He sat down, hands resting on the desk, and stared at the stack of paperwork in front of him. And he thought about the rules. The ones they never wrote down. The ones that always seemed to work against him. Nathaniel had played by those rules for years. But now, for the first time, he wondered what would happen if he stopped. Nathaniel Lewis sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel with hands that felt too steady for what had just happened. He had known it was coming. He had seen the signs. The meetings. The sudden changes. The careful wording that was never outright accused but always implied. But knowing didn't soften the blow. It started with a memo. A crisp white sheet left on his desk. Signed not by Jennings, not by Calloway, but by someone higher up. A name he didn't recognize. Effective immediately, Nathaniel Lewis would be reassigned to a back office position. Restructuring, they called it. Streamlining efficiency. The new position came with no pay cut. No official reprimand. Just distance. Distance from the clients he had built trust with. Distance from the coworkers who had once depended on him. Distance from the place he had made for himself. It was strategic. It was silent. It was how these things were always done. Nathaniel sat there, the memo between his fingers, staring at the ink as though he could will it into disappearing. You okay? He looked up. It was Carter, the junior teller, young, sharp, and still naive enough to believe things could be fair if you worked hard enough. Nathaniel forced a smile. Yeah, just changes. Carter's eyes flicked to the memo. And something in his face shifted. A quiet understanding. I heard about it, he said, lowering his voice. It ain't right. Nathaniel gave a short, humorless laugh. Since when has that mattered? Carter hesitated. You could fight it. Go to our. Make a complaint. Nathaniel studied him. He thought of every time he had seen this play out before. The slow chipping away. The quiet removals. The way people like him were always given a choice that wasn't really a choice. Accept it, or leave. He folded the memo and tucked it into his pocket. HR works for them. Carter looked away, jaw tight. Yeah, he muttered. I know. For a moment, they sat in silence. Then Carter spoke again, voice careful. I don't think they expect you to stay. Nathaniel turned that over in his mind. He had played by their rules. He had done the work. Kept his head down. Stayed patient. Stayed composed. And still, here he was. Maybe Carter was right. Maybe they wanted him to leave. Maybe they had always wanted that. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said. I think you're right. Now, in the quiet of his car, Nathaniel stared at the bank through the windshield. He thought about the years he had spent there. The way he had molded himself into something palatable. Something non-threatening. Something professional. And still, it had not been enough. It was never enough. His fingers flexed over the steering wheel. For the first time, he didn't feel tired. He felt ready. Because if they had already decided how his story would end, then maybe it was time to write it himself. Nathaniel Lewis stepped into the bank for what he knew would be the last time. Not because he had decided to leave, but because he had decided to stay. They had made their move. Quiet and strategic, hoping he would accept it with the same patience. The same compliance that had kept him afloat all these years. But he was done being patient. He took the elevator up to the executive floor, past the glass offices where men like Calloway and Jennings made decisions behind closed doors. At the receptionist's desk, he stopped. I need to see Mr. Calloway. The woman behind the desk, Rachel, her name was, looked startled. Do you have an appointment? Mr. Lewis? No. He met her gaze. But I have time. Rachel hesitated. Something in Nathaniel's stance, in the calm certainty of his voice, made her reach for the phone without further protest. A quiet exchange. A pause. Then, you can go in. Nathaniel stepped forward and pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, Calloway was seated behind his desk. His face a carefully arranged mask of surprise. Nathaniel, he gestured to the chair across from him. Please, sit. Nathaniel didn't sit. He placed the memo on the desk. unfolded it, and smoothed it flat with his palm. You should have just fired me. Calloway exhaled sharply through his nose. As if amused. Nathaniel, I don't think you're seeing this for what it is. This reassignment, quote, is a removal, Nathaniel interrupted. A slow, quiet erasure. Calloway leaned back, his fingers laced together. You're making this into something it's not. Nathaniel tilted his head. Am I? There was a long silence. Then Calloway sighed, as if this were all terribly unfortunate. You have to understand, there are certain expectations. Quote, I've met every expectation. Nathaniel cut in. I've done the work. I've built the relationships. I've played by your rules. And still, this is where I end up. Calloway's jaw tightened. You want me to leave? Nathaniel said. You want me to make this easy for you. But I won't. Calloway let out a slow breath. Nathaniel, quote, you move me out of sight. But I stay. You push me into a corner. But I stay. You put obstacles in my way. And still, I stay. Nathaniel let the words settle. Let Calloway feel the weight of them. You're not going to make me disappear. When Nathaniel walked out of the office, he knew the war wasn't won. But this battle? This one, he had won. Because now, they knew, he wasn't going anywhere.